All right, everybody. This is for Latin 2. Today we went over the passive voice in Latin. We'll review a little bit of the active voice and all that and the endings, and then we'll go into the passive voice. We're going to see how it's formed in Latin and English, and what does it mean? What does it mean to be passive voice and active voice? That's our goals for today. So there are two types of what we call voices in Latin and English. They are active and passive. We are going to explain here on the next slide what active is first in English and how it looks in Latin, and then we'll talk about passive voice and how it works in English and Latin as well. So these voices basically tell you how the sentence is going to be set up. That's all it is. It's a type of sentence is basically what I'm trying to say. So, active voice in English and Latin, the subject performs the action. For example, if we have a sentence, the man carries the food, the subject is we're or the man. He is carrying, he's literally doing the action of carrying, portat. He's carrying the food. So in active voice, the subject does whatever the verb tells it. Actively doing it. That is why it's called the active voice. Again, tells you what kind of sentence it is. In Latin, we have certain endings that tell us the verb will be the active voice. So remember, nouns have their case and all that kind of stuff. They do not have voice. The only way you're going to recognize the active and the passive, there's two ways. First way is through the verb. So far, we have learned the only way that we can tell that it's in the active voice is through the endings. And we've already learned those endings. OST, must to assent. If you don't remember those endings, they don't look familiar to you, it looks kind of crazy, make sure you go back and review the present tense, future tense, imperfect, all of that, using these endings. Because that is a big part of this, is conjugating things with the right endings. That'll tell you if it's actively an active voice verb. Okay? Now, if you remember, we have 6 tenses. Present, future, imperfect, perfect, pluperfect, future perfect. I'm only focusing on the present tense right now. Thursday, we might go over, future and imperfect or something, but we're not going to go through all of it. We're also only going to focus on the first and second conjugations because those are the ones you're going to see the most. Okay? So, passive voice. That was what the active voice is and how you recognize it in Latin and English. In the passive voice, it's basically flip-flopping the subject and the direct object. So the subject is now the direct object, basically, and the direct object is now the subject. So here's an example. Same sentence. We switched it around. So before we had the food is carried, not the food, the man carries the food. We switch the food to the subject. So the food is carried, that's the passive voice, by the man. So the man's still kind of doing the carrying, but he's passively doing it, right? He's not the subject doing it. He's passively doing it, and that's why it's called the passive voice. In other words, the subject of the food is being carried. Here's kind of where I'm going with this. Active voice, you have you love, or you carry, or you eat, or something like that. Passive voice, here's the difference. Still have the same subject, the you, right? You have to include a to be linking verb. Is, am, was, are, were, that kind of stuff. And then you add the past tense of the verb meaning. So in this case, loved. You are loved. That's the two differences between passive and active. Another way to kind of figure out if it's passive, if you ask yourself, who are you being loved by? If you can say by who or by what at the end of your translation of the verb, that's a passive voice sentence. You are loved. Well, by who? By what? That is a passive voice because you are asking by who or what. That is another way that you can distinguish the two. In English, like I said, it's a very similar form of the verb to be placed between the subject and the verb. Am, is, are, were. In this case, because we're using present, it's going to be am, is, or are. Then you have the past form tense of the verb after the verb of to be, the linking verb. So, loved, ate, held, any of the past ones. The difference between English and Latin is that Latin you only have to have one word, the verb. You don't have to have the form of the to be part is included in that verb. Okay? You'll see that in a second. So, how do you recognize it? How do you, besides asking yourself by who or what, the main thing that you want to recognize to see that it's passive voice is the endings. So if you remember, in the active voice, we had our own set of endings for Latin, OST, mustusent. In Latin passive voice, same thing. We have endings that tell us it's passive voice. They are ar, ris, tur, mer, mini, intur. And again, you have to memorize those. If you just go through it, make a Quizlet or something, go ar, ris, tur, mer, mini, intur, it'll be really easy. There are the pronouns that go with, same pronouns, I in the first singular, you in the second singular, he, she, it in the third singular, we first plural, you or y'all in the second plural, and then they in the third plural. Same ones we've been using, just different endings, tells you it's in the passive voice, not the active voice. So you translate it as is loved or is held or whatever the verb means. Same thing we did before when conjugating. Figure out the conjugation, find the stem from the second principal part, apply those endings, then translate the verb. So, and you'll do this in one of your exercises. First conjugation has an ARE, second conjugation has a long ERE, third has a short ERE, fourth has an IRE at the end of the second principal part. Take off that RE, there's your stem. Okay? Then you apply the endings that we just learned to make it passive voice. And you translate it with a form, a linking verb form, am, is, are, and then the past tense of the verb. We'll see this in a second. We're going to use amo for this. Amo, amare, amawi, amato. 4 principal parts. Go to the second principal part. We see that it has an ARE. That means it's the first conjugation. Stem of the verb, you take off the RE, we have AMA. You use that to add the endings to, which remember are ar, ris, tur, mer, mini, intur. And when you translate it, you use, because it's present tense, is, and there are different endings and different forms for the rest of them that tells you the difference between tenses. But for present, it's ar, ris, tur, mer, mini, intur. If you translate it as form to be, am, is, or are, and then the past tense of amo, which is loved, right? Here's how it looks. If you remember, AMA is our stem. Now, remember that the first person singular ending normally is an AMA and an R. So amar sounds kind of harsh. So, as they did before, they change it to amor. Sounds pleasant, sounds nice. It's all about, what's pleasing to the ear. The rest of them are all the same, though. Amor, amaris, amator, amamor, amamini, amantor. So you can see stem plus ending, except for that first one. That's it. Okay? Second principal part, take off that RE, there's your stem, put it all the way through. Hopefully that sounds familiar because you did that throughout any of the forms of the present we did before. How you translate it. There is the form of to be in the middle. Am, are, is, are. I am loved. You are loved. He, she, it is loved. Notice loved is past tense. That's what I was saying. how you translate it in the passive. If you see one of those endings, you translate it as I am loved, or I am held, or I am eaten, or something like that. Now, I told you there's two ways to recognize the passive voice. One is the verb endings. Second is this. In the passive voice, the person of the action is in the ablative case and is known as the ablative of agent. So that by whoever or whatever, that's the ablative of agent. It uses a preposition, a or ob, similar to a or an. Ob is used with the next word starting with a vowel. A is used if it starts with a consonant. Here's an example. Kibis, meaning food. The food, portatur, so we have that tour, which tells you it's passive, so you translate it as is carried. It's present tense. The food is carried, again, by who or what. And we have our next thing. We have an a or ob, which tells us the ablative of agent, and then the noun. So by the slave, or a slave, if you want to be specific. So the doer of the action is the slave. He is carrying the food. It's just a different way of forming it so that your direct object is now the subject. And yes, I spelled slave wrong. I apologize. Here's an example of construction, how you switch these over. So let's say we have an active voice sentence. I love the dog. Let's make it passive. Direct object goes to the subject, the dog. Change that love into a passive voice verb, is loved. And then who's doing the loving? Well, you are, but accusatively. So by me. The dog is loved by me. So you use the ablative of agent only when it's a passive voice. You can use it in other cases, but most of the times it's used this. One more. Bad men, Molly Weary, are designing Perrant bad plans, mala consilia. Again, make it passive, switch the mala consilia into the subject. Still going to be mala consilia. Bad plans. Change the verb to a passive voice verb. You can tell by the tour. Are designed. And then you have to put the ablative of agent. A malis viris. By bad men. Okay? So you're kind of switching things around. And that's what makes active and passive work. If you have any questions, email me or come to my office hours, which are on the Skype, 9 to 9:45 Mondays and Wednesdays. Okay? Simon is in OneNote. These notes are in OneNote. Check it out. You'll be good. All right? See you later.